into your terrorist proxies, you don't need to answer because we already know it. Now is the time for action. Sanctions must not be lifted, they must be imposed now on the regime's economy, on its terror network, on its ballistic missile program, and on the individual leaders who sit in Tehran and plot murder as their foreign policy. In Syria, jihadist forces have traveled south of Damascus to the Druze city of Suwaida, where they have committed unimaginable atrocities. Hundreds of innocent men, women, and children now lie dead. I have personally received hundreds of calls from my Druze friends from Israel, terrified and horrified by what is happening to their people. Their family ties cross the border. Their brothers and sisters live both in Suwaida and in Israel. For us, this is personal. It is Israel's sacred moral duty to stand by our Druze brothers and sisters in their time of need. We are guided by our unshakable moral compass. We will not stand idly by while innocent minorities are slaughtered, just kilometers away from their Israeli family members. So yes, the Middle East today is embroiled in chaos, but is also filled with opportunity. There is chaos for the innocent hostages still trapped in Hamas's tunnels. Chaos for the civilians and minorities in Lebanon and Syria still facing terror. Chaos for the entire region as Iran continues to push the world to the edge. But there is also opportunity, because the forces of darkness have been weakened. Hamas has lost much of its terror infrastructure and its senior leadership. Hezbollah was crippled by Israel's operations last year. Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs have been set back in ways that were once thought impossible. Israel is making the Middle East safer for everyone who values peace and calm. In other words, we are doing the work of the United Nations. While Israel dismantles terror networks and protects innocent lives, what does the UN do? It clings to its political agenda. It protects its bias. It defends the agencies that have long abandoned neutrality. You don't need to look far to see this bias in action. Just look at the statements and conduct of Tom Fletcher and his agency, OCHA. Too often, Mr. Fletcher has forgotten or decided to ignore that his statements have consequences. He has repeatedly abandoned his sacred responsibility to act without bias, choosing instead to fuel a political campaign against Israel. Several weeks ago, Mr. Fletcher claimed that 14,000 babies in Gaza would starve to death within 48 hours. That statement was false. It was baseless. While he quietly walked it back, the damage had already been done. But with another lie, Mr. Fletcher has not walked back: the accusation that Israel is committing genocide. He knows it's not true. He knows it. There are facts, international law, you have to prove intention. Yet he said it anyway. That word carries more weight than any other accusation. To use it falsely is to dishonor the memory of real genocide victims and to endanger more lives by fueling hatred. It is not too late to correct the record. Israel demands that Mr. Fletcher retract his statement, publicly, unequivocally, and immediately. But this is no longer just about one official's reckless remarks. His responsibility has infected OCHA from top to bottom. Let's start with the data. On May 6, OCHA published figures claiming to show civilian casualties in Gaza. Officially. Just 2 days later, those figures were reduced by over 10,000. Not by 1, not by 10, not by 100, and not by 1,000, by 10,000, just like that. No explanation, no accountability, just a quiet adjustment. No, 10,000 less. As if the original numbers weren't already plastered across headline worldwide. OCHA has built its reports almost exclusively on data from Hamas-run institutions. There is no independent verification, no cross-checking, no effort to distinguish between civilians and terrorists. Every casualty is listed as a civilian. This violates the UN's own standards in every other conflict. But when it comes to Israel, those standards disappear. At the same time, OCHA has actively undermined Israel's humanitarian efforts in Gaza. It tracks only UN-coordinated aid while ignoring the thousands of trucks of food, medical supplies, and fuel that Israel, the private sector, and other partners have delivered. OCHA has undercounted over 13,000 trucks. That's a deliberate choice to misrepresent reality. Perhaps most disturbing, Israel has uncovered clear evidence of Hamas affiliation within OCHA's ranks. So when you combine all of that with Mr. Fletcher's repeated falsehoods, you are not looking at a humanitarian agency, you are looking at a propaganda machine. I have said many times before, Israel believes in humanitarian work. We are committed to helping civilians, to protecting innocents, and to ensuring aid reaches those who need it. But we will not work with organizations that have chosen politics over principles. Mr. Fletcher has made it clear that OCHA is no longer a neutral agency. Israel is therefore left with no choice but to act. Today, I announce that Israel will take steps to ensure that what has been happening with OCHA will no longer continue. Hundreds of OCHA employees are undergoing security vetting. Key employees will not have their permits renewed following clear evidence of strong affiliation with Hamas. Some were even involved in the atrocities of October 7. Israel will no longer grant automatic visas to OCHA's international staff. Visas will now be limited to 1 month's terms. What was will no longer be. Jonathan Whitehall, OCHA's head of office for the so-called territories, has consistently and outrageously demonstrated his bias and agenda against the State of Israel. He will not have his visa renewed, and he will leave the country by July 29th. Mr. President, at some point, enough is enough. Enough with the hypocrisy. Enough with the bias. Enough with the endless defamation campaign against the State of Israel. Israel is doing the job the UN was created to do. We are dismantling terror networks. We are protecting civilians. We are standing up for minorities under threat. While Israel fulfills this mission, many within the UN spend all of their energy, 24/7, trying to smear Israel, protecting its own biases, siding with the very actors that fuel the chaos. It is time to return to the UN's core purpose. Israel will continue to do what is necessary to protect our people, defend our borders, help our neighbors in need, and bring our hostages home. We invite the UN, finally, to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Representative of Israel, for your statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala Rasool al-Kareem. Excellencies, Ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to preside over this important open debate on the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. I thank Assistant Secretary General Khalid Khayari for his comprehensive briefing. For decades, the Palestinian people have endured the worst form of occupation and apartheid. They have been denied their fundamental and inalienable rights, including the right to self-determination and statehood. What we have witnessed in Gaza for the last 22 months is not just a humanitarian catastrophe, but a collapse of humanity itself. Gaza has become a graveyard for innocent lives as well as for the international law, particularly the international humanitarian law. Over 58,000 Palestinians, most of them women and children, have been killed in Israel's brutal military assault. The systematic targeting of hospitals, schools, UN facilities, aid convoys, and refugee camps are not incidental. These are deliberate acts of collective punishment in flagrant violation of IHL, numerous Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, as well as the binding provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice. Excellencies, the hunger crisis in Gaza has reached unprecedented and deeply alarming levels. According to the United Nations World Food Programme, a third of the population not eating for multiple days in a row, an indicator of catastrophic levels of food insecurity. Excellencies, the Palestinian question is a litmus test for the credibility of the United Nations, the Security Council, and the integrity of the international law. Failure to uphold the rights of the Palestinian people will embolden impunity and undermine the legitimacy of the very international order we all claim to defend and uphold. The Security Council must live up to its responsibility and ensure compliance with its own decisions. Pakistan reaffirms its unwavering and principled support and solidarity with the Palestinian people and their right to a viable, sovereign, and contiguous state of Palestine based on the pre-1967 borders with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital. This is the only just and durable solution, enshrined in Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, the Arab Peace Initiative, and the consensus position of the OSCE. We urge the Security Council to pursue with unity and urgency the following concrete measures. First, an immediate, permanent, and unconditional ceasefire in Gaza and across the occupied Palestinian territory, including the full implementation of the Council Resolution 2735. We appreciate the ongoing diplomatic efforts aimed at securing a ceasefire in Gaza and hope these would yield tangible and meaningful outcomes, including a permanent end to the war. We appreciate the role played by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States in this regard. Second, unfettered, sustained, and secure humanitarian access to all civilians in need and the protection of aid workers, medical teams, and the UN personnel. Immediate steps should be taken to ensure the delivery of life-saving food and medical assistance, restore humanitarian supply lines, and prevent famine conditions from taking hold. Third, renewed and reinforced international support to UNRWA, which remains indispensable to the survival of millions of Palestinians. Fourth, an end to the forced displacement, illegal settlement expansion, and annexation of Palestinian land, particularly in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Fifth, implementation of the Arab and OIC-led reconstruction plan for Gaza, which represents a vital framework for post-conflict recovery and rehabilitation, sustainable development, and the restoration of dignity for the Palestinian people. And sixth and last, a political horizon is the need of the hour, the revival of a genuine and time-bound political process to achieve a just, comprehensive, and lasting two-state solution in accordance with international law and relevant UN resolutions. Pakistan welcomes the growing international momentum in support of the Palestinian statehood and full membership of the UN. We urge those that have yet to recognize the state of Palestine to do so as soon as they can. We also welcome the convening on 28th of July of the International Conference on the Two-State Solution, co-chaired by Saudi Arabia and France, to help generate renewed momentum and take concrete actions towards achieving the two-state solution. Excellencies, a comprehensive and enduring peace in the Middle East requires addressing all interrelated crises across the region through effective multilateralism and peaceful settlement of disputes. Pakistan supports the stabilization of Syria through an inclusive political process. Syria's unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity must be upheld. Israel must withdraw immediately from the separation zone established under the 1974 disengagement agreement and from the occupied Syrian Golan Heights in accordance with Security Council resolutions 242, 338, and 497. In Lebanon, the ceasefire understanding and resolution 1701 must be respected and the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Lebanon safeguarded. We must support the peace process in Yemen, facilitated by the UN and regional actors, particularly Saudi Arabia and Oman. The sharp rise in tension and violence as a result of Israeli aggression and unlawful military strikes in Iran was profoundly disturbing. These attacks set a dangerous precedent and pose grave threat to regional and global peace. Pakistan calls for urgent recourse to dialogue and diplomacy consistent with the UN Charter to find a peaceful and lasting resolution to this issue in accordance with the rights, obligations, and responsibilities of all parties. Excellencies, history has taught us that the use of force and unilateral military actions only deepen conflicts and entrench divisions with tragic human and humanitarian consequences. The way forward lies in upholding international law, ending foreign occupation, rejecting the use of force, and promoting solutions through dialogue and diplomacy. It is time to give the Palestinian people what they have been denied for too long: justice, freedom, dignity, and a state of their own. That is the path to durable peace and stability in the Middle East. I thank you all. I now resume my functions as President of the Council, and I will give the floor to the representative of Greece.
I thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank Assistant Secretary General Mr. Khaled Chiari for his detailed and insightful briefing. Mr. President, a lot has transpired in the volatile region of the Middle East since our last open debate in April, demonstrating the potential pitfalls in a part of the world where security can unravel in an instant. The recent cessation of hostilities between Iran and Israel has been a welcome development. It is now critical for IAEA inspectors to resume their activity, verifying the status of Iran's enriched uranium stockpiles and enrichment capabilities. We urge Tehran to abide by the JCPOA, return to the negotiations table, and uphold its commitments as part of the NPT. Volatility in the Red Sea region, a nodal maritime route, exposes the international community to acute security risks and economic uncertainty, jeopardizing global trade and supply chains. Underscoring the importance of immediately ceasing all attacks against merchant ships, we reiterate our call for the full respect and implementation of the UN arms embargo against the Houthis by all. The core of regional tensions and turbulence lies where it all started on October 7, 2023, with the horrendous terrorist attack of Hamas on Israel. As discussed a week ago in this very chamber, for yet another time, a year and a half into this conflict, a severe humanitarian crisis has taken hold of the entire Gaza Strip, with the population facing conditions of distress and struggling to survive. We welcome the recent agreement between Israel and the European Union on scaling up humanitarian aid for the people in Gaza, as it provides some much-needed hope. The agreement demonstrates that dialogue with Israel can bear results. On this premise, we urge Israel to allow and facilitate the safe, unconditional, massive, and unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid into the Strip. We expect the agreed steps to be implemented with a sense of urgency. Allowing a substantially increased humanitarian aid to enter the Strip and opening the southern and northern crossings is imperative. Undoubtedly, to achieve this, the expertise of the United Nations, its agency network, and UNRWA remains invaluable. At the same time, we stress that any humanitarian plan must adhere to the core principles of international humanitarian law, cover all parts of Gaza, and support the existing humanitarian operations within the Strip. Israel's Gaza Humanitarian Fund plan falls short of this promise. As efforts led by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States to secure a much-needed ceasefire deal are ongoing, let us recall that hostages continue to suffer, held in captivity by Hamas for 19 consecutive months. Having repeatedly condemned the October 7 terrorist attacks and the ongoing detention and inhumane treatment of hostages, we reiterate our demand for their immediate and unconditional release. We deplore the refusal of Hamas to hand them over. While conditions in Gaza remain dire, the security situation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem also raises concerns. We condemn the escalation and the continued settler violence, the expansion of illegal settlements, and Israel's military operations. Settlement expansion is contrary to international law and the relevant Security Council resolutions, seriously undermining the prospects for a two-state solution. The repeated attacks on Taiba, one of the Christian-majority villages in the West Bank, are particularly alarming. In the same vein, we express our deep sorrow for the tragic loss and casualties caused by the attack on the Catholic Church of the Holy Family in Gaza. Places of worship and religious sites should never be targeted. Mr. President, there is no military solution for Gaza. Greece, along with the United Kingdom and 27 international partners, recently came together with a simple yet urgent message. The war in Gaza must end now. The only solution for Gaza would be a political one. We thus look forward to the upcoming high-level conference on the implementation of the two-state solution under the co-chairpersonship of France and Saudi Arabia, hoping it will bring new impetus to the political process. In this spirit, Greece is ready to engage to bring the Arab plan, as presented by Egypt, forward, developing it further where necessary. The plan constitutes a constructive proposal for the day after, when an empowered and reformed Palestinian Authority will be able to exert effective governance in Gaza and the West Bank, without any government or security role for Hamas, and definitely without any forced displacement of Palestinians. All sides must now harness the necessary political courage to agree to a ceasefire, end the war, and pave the way toward a political process towards two states living side by side in peace and security. Turning over to Syria, ahead of our monthly briefing next week, We echo the Secretary General's deep concern over the continued violence in the Druze majority area of Shueida, resulting in hundreds of casualties, including civilians, with reports also of summary executions. We condemn all acts of sectarian violence, echoing the Secretary General's plea towards the interim authorities and local leaders to de-escalate. We also echo the call towards the interim authorities to transparently and openly investigate the incidents, holding all those responsible into account. Finally, yet importantly, Lebanon seems to be staying the right course, albeit not without significant challenges. Aware of UNIFIL's importance in preserving the cessation of hostilities and thus for the maintenance of regional peace and security, Greece fully supports the mission's mandate renewal. All parties need to fully abide by Security Council Resolution 1701 and the provisions of the November ceasefire understanding, contributing to the security of both Israel and Lebanon. Reaffirming our commitment to the preservation of Lebanon's sovereignty and territorial integrity, we consider it imperative that we support the country's efforts to turn the page and the Lebanese government's efforts to extend its authority over the entire territory of Lebanon, while implementing much necessary reforms. We commend the progress of the Lebanese armed forces in the redeployment and bringing all weapons under state control, indicative of the Lebanese leadership's resolve in meeting its international obligations. Greece is steadfast in its commitment of support for the Lebanese institutions, including the LAAF. Mr. President, from Gaza and Syria to Lebanon and the Red Sea, the Middle East is being transformed before our very eyes. Greece will continue to support the role of the United Nations and this Council in monitoring the transformation of this volatile region, adding its voice in support of regional and international peace and security. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Representative of Greece. I will now give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Thank you, Minister. We welcome your presidency of this quarterly open debate in the Security Council on the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. And we would like to thank the Assistant Secretary General Khaled Kiari for his detailed briefing. Today, in the Security Council chamber, once again, we are hearing very worrying assessments of the tragic developments in the Middle East. And this is both in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as well as within the context of broader regional developments. And the root cause for essentially all of the Middle East crises and collisions which create challenges for the security of many countries in the region is the fact that the Palestinian issue remains unresolved. Whereas the main parameters for the settlement of this is something that the international community agreed many decades ago. As a result, a growing number of Middle Eastern countries are beginning to forget what peaceful life without bombs, explosions, and threats of full-scale hostilities is like. Unfortunately, during the time elapsed since our previous debates on this, a spiral of escalation in the region has become intensified and pulled new states into it. In June, we all witnessed a very sharp military confrontation between Iran and Israel. It was accompanied by the Western Jerusalem strikes, with support of Washington strikes, on the nuclear facilities in Iran, the facilities which were under IAEA safeguards. These unjustified attacks are not just a gross violation of the UN Charter, but they also severely undermine the foundations of the nuclear non-proliferation regime. We strongly and unconditionally condemn attacks against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Through this act of aggression, Washington and West Jerusalem pushed the region to the brink of a large-scale war, which could have had the most dire radiological consequences, not just for Iran, but also for all of the states in the Middle East. Despite the announcement made by the Trump administration there was a ceasefire between Iran and Israel, despite that, the situation remains very fragile. As a matter of principle, we do not share the concept of peace through strength, which is taken on by Washington. The long-standing issues in the regions cannot be resolved this way, and new waves of violence can only compound the difficulties. What is needed is looking for political and diplomatic solutions within the Middle East settlement, but also more broadly regarding all of the conflicts in the region. The attempts to cowboy-style put the squeeze on some actors and intimidate others create a short-term effect and cannot provide for a long-term balance of interest in this very difficult Middle East landscape. West Jerusalem should finally understand that it's impossible to change geography and that Israel would have to coexist with all of its neighbors. And for that, Israel needs to have at least a minimal level of trust between Israel and them. This cannot be done when there is a continued radical anti-Palestinian rhetoric, when there is a denial of the right of Palestinians to exist within their own state. But unfortunately, what we're witnessing now is exactly the opposite. We, for example, are very worried by what is being said by Israeli leaderships when they're announcing their intent to resolve the issue of OPT, in particular in Gaza, in one fell swoop. This is shored up by the provocative plans to fully annex the Strip, and this is also shored up by other provocative public steps. As recently as yesterday, in the Knesset, there was a conference entitled Riviera in Gaza, From Ideal to Reality. During that conference, the Minister of Finance, Smotrich, said that he discussed with the leadership of Tzahal the parameters of gradually absorbing the Strip through recreating illegal settlements in Gaza. In other words, we're talking about recolonization, reoccupation of Palestinian territory here. This is a monstrously cynical approach, which essentially dooms the Palestinians to either death or exile. The moral and political duty of the international community here is to make sure that these plans do not come to be. The very way of phrasing this issue this way is unconscionable, even hypothetically, because it implies that the Palestinians are second-class people and they're not masters of their own fate. For now, the IDF continues clearing up the Strip regardless of the number of victims of their military operation. It's about 60,000 Palestinians who died, and regardless of the Palestinian infrastructure destruction. Daily we receive information about hundreds of new victims amongst the people in Gaza, including in food distribution places in the vicinity of the infamous Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is nothing else than a means of using humanitarian assistance as a weapon or for blackmail. For example, in the last 24 hours, 99 Palestinians died. 26 of them were lining up for rations. There are also indiscriminate strikes against religious facilities. On the 18th of July, there was an attack against the only Catholic Church of Holy Family in Gaza. According to the information we're getting, this was a direct hit against the church, as a result of which parishioners and the clergy were seriously wounded. We strongly condemn this kind of action. We're most seriously concerned by the fact that the people in Gaza do not have an opportunity of obtaining adequate medical assistance. Essentially, all of the medical infrastructure in the Strip is destroyed. There are still shortages of all basic necessities, medicines, medical instruments, fuel, and even bags are needed for burial. Hospitals receive hundreds of patients daily, including children who are on the brink of death from starvation. According to the figures as of yesterday, in the past 48 hours, 33 people died from starvation. They're including 12 children. And these figures, as we all know, unfortunately will only grow. Malnutrition is something that doctors and nurses are suffering from as well. They cannot expect to receive adequate food under essential blockade of Gaza either. Mr. President, we are convinced that all those present here very well know the assessment issued by international humanitarian organizations and UN agencies of what is happening in Gaza. They're saying that it goes beyond what is acceptable even at war. In November 2023, the Secretary General stated that Gaza had become a huge children's cemetery. Recently, the Commissioner General of UNRWA, Mr. Lazzarini, described the situation in Gaza as hell on earth. Such assessments are issued by all humanitarians without exception, all of those who are working in the sector or traveling to it. How does Israel react to all of that? We have heard that today after the permanent representative of that country essentially stated that they will be squeezing OCHA from the occupied territory and there will be sanctions against its high-level representatives. We just need to find out now whether Washington is also going to be covering up for its allies without a murmur as well, whether they will support their new inhuman steps, which goes in counter to what in other instances they proclaim as to be human rights protection. How much longer will this terrible situation continue, which not only humiliates the Palestinians, but also undermines our own faith in the humanitarian ideals, humankind, and justice? Against the background of the disaster in Gaza, what is somewhat obscured is the situation on the West Bank. But unfortunately, this gives us equal reasons for worry because the military operation continues there, economic suffocation, and arbitrary arrest against the Palestinians, property expropriation, and demolition of houses. To this, we need to add the unconstrained violence by the settlers, very frequently under the lenient eye of the Israeli military, and the record pace of settlement construction and at the same time an open declaration to annex the West Bank. This is part of the overall stance to destroy any kind of premise or an opportunity for Palestinians to have their own state, depriving them of the possibility to survive in the occupied territories. Can we really allow ourselves not to notice that and allow the Israeli policy of fait accompli the possibility of fully trample underfoot the international documents about a two-state solutions? Mr. President, the Russian approaches to the current situation in the OPT and in general to the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian settlement have been consistent and are based on obvious truths. We have consistently advocated in favor of an immediate and unconditional ceasefire and the release of all hostages and those who are forcibly detained, ensuring that there is safe and unimpeded humanitarian assistance, the relaunching of the peace process on the two-state basis, which would ensure the implementation of the legitimate aspirations of Palestinians. We need to always bear in mind the ultimate goal here, the creation of an independent Palestinian state and within the 1967 border with the capital in East Jerusalem, coexisting with Israel in peace and security. The attempts to put the Palestinian issue onto the back burner, including the issue of the historic injustice as regards the Palestinians' rights to self-determination and return, is one of the reasons there is a recurrence of violence not just in the Palestinian territories but in the region as a whole, as well as growth of extremism and terrorism. And the only way to overcome this is to consolidate the efforts of the international community on the basis of the universally acknowledged basis, with the main key element here to state formula. Overall, the issues in the OPT and in the region have become so tangled that the international community needs, at a minimum, to have a very thoughtful and unblinkered discussion here on how to overcome that. What is particularly relevant in this situation is the International High-Level Conference in support of Palestine next week. We know the efforts made here by our French and Saudi co-presidencies to organize a conference, and it is our expectation that the conference will work out specific steps for the UN member states and international community, including steps to recognize Palestine and to protect the specialized humanitarian agencies, first and foremost UNRWA. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Representative of Russian Federation. I would now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me also thank Assistant Secretary General Chiari for his comprehensive briefing. Since our last open debate, the Middle East has continued to grapple with escalating conflict, humanitarian suffering, and tragic loss of life. From a devastating humanitarian situation in Gaza to the unprecedented military escalation between Israel and Iran in light of Iran's accelerated nuclear trajectory. From the resumption of Houthi attacks against commercial shipping in the Red Sea to their continuous attack against Israel and its subsequent responses. Most recently, the fighting in the Soweto province of Syria and Israel's strikes against Syrian territory. We must do all we can to prevent further escalation and a wider regional war. For stability to be restored in the Middle East, all parties must exercise utmost restraint and recommit to diplomacy. The situation is simply too fragile and too dangerous. Mr. President, we are convening today less than 1 week ahead of the high-level conference on the two-state solution, a conference that has the potential to advance concrete solutions for Israelis and Palestinians alike. It takes place against a backdrop of appalling levels of human suffering in Gaza, the continued agony of Israeli hostages and their families, and a further deterioration in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. We deplore the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza, where the population has been squeezed into less than 14% of the territory. Their reality is one of imminent death by hostilities, starvation, or disease. A daily specter of not knowing what to fear the most, dying from starvation or from seeking food. Most recently, civilians in northern Gaza were attacked while seeking aid from a coordinated WFP convoy. We strongly condemn all attacks on civilians seeking to obtain humanitarian aid. This needs to stop. Denmark's position is clear. Civilians, including humanitarians and UN personnel, as well as civilian infrastructure, must be protected in accordance with international law. We are deeply concerned by Israel's new evacuation orders encompassing the UN compound in Gaza, as well as the recent attacks on a warehouse and facilities sheltering WHO staff. All UN premises are inviolable and must be protected. Humanitarian aid must flow freely, safely, and at scale into Gaza, in line with international humanitarian law. We have heard, time and time again, that the UN and its partners are ready to deliver. They must be allowed to do so. And the UN, including OCHA, has our full support. The vilification of UN organizations and rejection of visas for senior UN staff are in no one's interest. And until a two-state solution is realized, UNRWA continues to be uniquely mandated by the General Assembly to deliver essential state-like services to Palestine refugees. Denmark continues to call for an immediate and lasting ceasefire, and for the immediate, unconditional, and dignified release of all hostages kept by Hamas. We reiterate that Hamas can never be allowed to play a role in the future of Gaza. Mr. President, developments in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, are further jeopardizing the prospects of a two-state solution. They must not be ignored. Denmark condemns the continuing acceleration of settlement construction and intensification of settler attacks against Palestinians. Just last month, Israeli settlers endured as many as 100 Palestinians, the highest monthly figure since OCHA began documenting casualties in 2005. We reiterate that all Israeli settlements are a clear violation of international law and call on the Israeli authorities to cease all further expansions and hold settlers accountable for their crimes. In this regard, we strongly oppose Israel's decision to assume the long-stalled E1 settlement expansion plan, which was add more than 3,400 new units and essentially cut the West Bank in two. We reiterate that resolutions of this Council, including 2334, are not merely words on paper. They must be fully implemented. Mr. President, in closing, as we look to the next week's high-level conference, it is critical for the international community to come together to advance concrete measures for the implementation of a two-state solution. This remains the only viable path to sustainable peace in the Middle East and a future where Palestinians and Israelis live side by side in peace and security. Meanwhile, we need to continue to work for de-escalation and lasting peace in the wider region. Denmark looks forward to contributing constructively to these ends. I thank you.
Thank you, Madam Representative of Denmark. I would now give the floor to Representative of China.
Thank you, President. I welcome your presence, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs Dar, and presiding over the meeting. I thank ASG Chiari for his briefing. For some time now, the Middle East has been mired in turmoil, with conflicts and confrontations escalating. The conflict in Gaza, dragging on for 21 months, has caused over 58,000 deaths and an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. Israel's continued military attacks, restrictions on access to supplies, and the implementation of a militarized aid distribution mechanism have repeatedly led to heavy civilian casualties. Recently, Israel launched ground offensive against Deir al-Balah in central Gaza, attacked WHO facilities, and searched, interrogated, and even detained its staff. We strongly condemn these. Military means are not the right way to resolve issues. More killings will not bring lasting peace. China urges Israel to immediately cease all military operations in Gaza, fulfill its obligations under international humanitarian law, fully restore humanitarian access, and support the UN and other humanitarian organizations in their aid effort. China firmly supports the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and USG Fletcher in their work. The country with significant influence over the party concerned should adopt an impartial and responsible approach and truly play a positive and constructive role. While the fighting in Gaza rages on, the situation in the West Bank is very tense. So far this year, settlement expansion and settler violence have killed over 600 Palestinians and injured over 5,000. The international community has repeatedly affirmed that settlement activities violate international law and council resolutions and must cease immediately. Israel should stop its attacks on the West Bank, curb settler violence, and conduct impartial investigations of all attacks and pursue accountability. President, elsewhere in the Middle East, the challenges to peace and stability are equally daunting. Israel's continued attacks on Syria and Lebanon and its illegal military presence have increased tensions. The sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of Syria and Lebanon must be fully respected, and the relevant Security Council resolutions should be effectively complied with. The Syrian interim authorities should promote an inclusive political process and effectively implement the obligations under international law, including counterterrorism. The international community should help and support the Lebanese government in its active governance. We call on the Houthis to stop targeting merchant ships, and all parties concerned to exercise calm and restraint in order to maintain the safety of shipping lanes in the Red Sea. It has been proved that war cannot resolve the Iranian nuclear issue, and a political solution is the only way forward. All parties should ensure that the ceasefire reached between Israel and Iran is effectively implemented and prevent the situation from escalating again. The parties concerned should restart dialogue and negotiations on an equal footing and address their legitimate concerns through consultations. Iran's commitment not to develop nuclear weapons should be taken seriously, and all parties should fully respect Iran's right to the peaceful uses of nuclear energy as a state party to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Relevant countries should abandon the practice of frequently resorting to threats and pressure, which will only intensify tensions and confrontations and even further undermine diplomatic efforts. President, lasting peace in the world would not be possible without a stable Middle East. The Middle East cannot remain under the shadow of conflicts forever, nor can its people continue to live in the insecurity of war. The question of Palestine lies at the heart of the Middle East issue, and the implementation of the two-state solution is the only viable way to resolving the question of Palestine. The international community must firmly reject unilateral actions that erode the foundation of the two-state solution and firmly oppose the dangerous attempts to annex Gaza and the West Bank. We welcome the high-level conference on the implementation of the two-state solution to be convened next week, and we look forward to its galvanizing strong momentum to the implementation of the two-state solution. I thank you, President.
Thank you, Mr. Representative of China. I would now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, let me first thank Pakistan for convening this open debate and express our appreciation to ASG Khaled Khiari for his sobering briefing. His words echo what every soul in this chamber already knows, what the world sees, and what history will not forget. The catastrophic suffering of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank alike. What we are witnessing is not war. It is annihilation, not only of people, but of life itself. This is a plan, a cruel, a deliberate plan to erase a people, to wipe away their roots from their homeland. But, Mr. President, no matter how many bombs fall, no matter how deep the pain of the Palestinian people in Gaza, Palestine is not living. Palestinians are not living. They are the olive tree, burned, broken, but never uprooted. The Israeli occupation may seem powerful, militarily overwhelmingly powerful. But is it eternal? Justice, however, long delayed, always finds its way. And the day will come when this horrible occupation ends. Mr. President, humanity is bleeding in Gaza. In the last 600 days. But so too is the very idea of law, of morality, of justice, of conscience. International law is being trampled. Famine is being openly used as a weapon. Just yesterday, 15 Palestinians died of hunger. The total is now 101, including 80 children. And these children are dying not from wounds, but from the silence of empty plates. In Gaza, famine is spreading like fire through dry land. It touches everyone. It affects everyone: doctors, nurses, journalists, humanitarian workers, UN staff. It affects everyone: children, mothers, the elderly. Yes, Gaza is starving. And the world, the international community, is only contemplating. And the Security Council is watching with no action. The cause is clear. The solution is well known. As Médecins Sans Frontières medical coordinator in Gaza said plainly, the starvation of people in Gaza is intentional. It could end tomorrow if Israeli authority allow food in at scale. But instead, aid convoys are blocked. Humanitarian centers are attacked. And the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, I should say Gaza Hunger Foundation, has tragically become a death trap. A trap endangering the very lives of the starving Palestinians that it claims feeding. As one of 3 Gazans does not eat for days, aid is no more a race for life. It has become a race to death. More than 1,000 people killed, over 6,500 injured, just for seeking help, just for seeking food, just for reaching out of bread. This is the blatant reality. As of today, almost 60,000 Palestinians have been killed by the Israeli occupying forces, while more than 143,000 have been injured. We will not forget them. Those who have committed these crimes, yes, crimes, should not, cannot lecture us on morality, on respect of human dignity, on respect of international humanitarian law. If they are keen to know the reality in the enclave, they should allow access, free access, in Gaza of journalists, human rights mandate holders, credible international NGOs, to investigate and to report to the world on the real situation in Gaza. And today, humanitarian organizations are attacked not only in the enclave, but also in this chamber. UNRWA, OCHA, WFP, ICRC, WHO. No flag protect them anymore. No UN flag, no cross, no crescent, no dove, Why? They tell the truth about the horrible situation in Gaza. They are the witness of a genocide. Mr. President, a ceasefire is long overdue. Yes, yet this Council remains bound by silence. We must not wait for permission to end the slaughter of dreams. Let us declare a ceasefire, unconditional and permanent ceasefire, not as a gesture, but as a duty to what remains of our shared soul, our shared mandate in this Security Council. Let us shield the remnant of dignity from the dust of collapsing home in Gaza, from the cries of children buried under the rubble. Mr. President, this pattern is not limited to Gaza. In the West Bank, we are witnessing an alarming escalation. Israel has announced a plan for further expanding settlements, open step toward annexation. Settler terrorism has reached unprecedented levels. Palestinians are being pushed out of their lands, of their homes. Their villages are burned. Their trees are chopped. Their lives, their family lives, are shattered. Even the sacred is not spared. Settlers repeatedly assault Al-Aqsa Mosque and attacks churches. Now, the famous Ibrahimi Mosque is under threat. Algeria condemns in the strongest terms these attacks and this violation of international law. And while we speak of Palestine, while we reaffirm the inalienable right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, to sovereignty over their land, while we advocate for the implementation of the two-state solution, the Knesset voted just today, not for peace, not for justice, but to claim what is not theirs. They call occupation sovereignty, sovereignty over the West Bank. What will the international community, what will this Security Council say this time? Another statement? Another immoral silence. President, to this barbarity, our answer must be enforcing respect of human rights, enforcing respect for human dignity. To starvation, our answer must be enforcing lifeline aid. To injustice, our answer must be the supremacy of law, enforcing the supremacy of law. And to the attempt to erase a nation, a Palestinian nation, our answer must be the establishment of a Palestinian state with Al-Quds Sharif as its capital. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Representative of Algeria. I now give the floor to Representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. Sierra Leone thanks the Presidency for convening this important and timely debate. The protracted crisis in the Middle East continues to demand the Council's urgent attention, principled clarity, and resolute action. I thank Assistant Secretary General Kerry for his detailed briefing. Mr. President, across the region, fragility remains a defining feature. While recent de-escalations in Lebanon and between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the State of Israel offer some measure of relief, other theaters remain dangerously unstable. Nowhere is this more pronounced than in the Syrian Arab Republic, where the resurgence of violence has taken a devastating toll. We reiterate our call for full respect and implementation of the 1974 Disengagement of Forces Agreement between Israel and Syria. All parties must uphold the ceasefire, exercise maximum restraint, and refrain from actions that could further destabilize the region. In this regard, we recall the primary responsibility of the Syrian authorities to ensure the safety and protection of all civilians, including religious and ethnic minorities. This responsibility is not only a matter of national duty, but a legal obligation under international, humanitarian, and human rights law. Turning to the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, the scale and depth of human suffering in Gaza over the past months defy comprehension. The cruelty and violence endured by civilians are deeply distressing and should stir the conscience of the international community. Yet, despite repeated calls for restraint and adherence to international obligations, meaningful action by those with the power to stop the suffering remains regrettably insufficient. Sierra Leone is particularly alarmed by three interrelated trends. First, the systematic obstruction of humanitarian access. Humanitarian actors, including United Nations agencies, have been impeded by access restrictions, targeted attacks, and the militarization of aid delivery points. These developments have rendered many humanitarian corridors perilous rather than protective, with the humanitarian architecture pushed to the brink of collapse. Essential life-saving assistance continues to be hindered by bureaucratic, political, and operational constraints. Second, the targeting and destruction of cultural, religious, and historic sites. Attacks on places of worship, cemeteries, and culturally significant landmarks are not merely acts of war. They seek to erase the identity and heritage of an entire people. When coupled with widespread destruction of homes, schools, and civilian infrastructure, these actions signal an alarming pattern of displacement and dispossession. Third, the deprivation of basic necessities. The use of siege tactics, repeated bombardments, and forced evacuations, including the recent evacuation order covering about 5.6 square kilometers of Deir Bala, which spans from neighborhoods, leaving the millions of Palestinians confined to ever-shrinking spaces, often without access to adequate food, clean water, or medical care. The use of starvation as a method of warfare is a grave breach of international humanitarian law. Even more concerning is reports that the latest evacuation orders affect United Nations premises and warehouses, which are protected under international law. We are also deeply concerned that the WHO staff residence was attacked 3 times in the last few days. We reiterate that the parties to the conflict must respect the inviolability of all United Nations staff, premises, warehouses, and other civilian sites. Taken together, these patterns point to a deeply troubling possibility: the risk of acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. As affirmed by International Court of Justice in its provisional measures, the 1948 Genocide Convention obliges international community to prevent such outcomes once the risk becomes known. To be clear, the invocation of atrocity prevention is not an attack on any state, religion, or people. It is rather a principled insistence on the rule of law, accountability, and the protection of civilians. Criticism of militia conduct or state policy must not be conflated with identity-based hate. Such confliction only serves to erode efforts towards peace, justice, and reconciliation. Mr. President, Sierra Leone unequivocally condemns the attacks of 7 October 2023 perpetrated by Hamas and other armed groups. The deliberate targeting of civilians and taking of hostages are unacceptable and constitute serious violations of international law. These crimes must be addressed through lawful and accountable means. However, we maintain that one atrocity cannot justify another. The principles of proportionality, distinction, and necessity must be upheld at all times. We also express grave concern regarding developments in the West Bank, where increasing settler violence, forced evictions, and demolitions further erode the prospects of peace and violate established norms under the 4th Geneva Convention. These acts threaten to undermine not only the two-state solution, but also the long-term stability of the region. Accordingly, Sierra Leone calls for the following. First, an immediate and unconditional ceasefire in Gaza and the West Bank as a necessary step to halt further loss of life and enable the restoration of humanitarian operations. Second, the release of all hostages, both Israeli civilians unlawfully held by Hamas and Palestinian detainees held without due process. Third, full, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access. We welcome recent initiatives to expand and aid delivery, but stress that these measures must be scaled up and the blockade lifted and militarization abandoned. Fourth, full compliance with ICJ's provisional measures, particularly those related to facilitating humanitarian aid and protecting civilians. The work of UNRWA and other UN agencies on the ground must be preserved and strengthened. Fifth, the rejection of any effort towards permanent displacement of Palestinians. Those forcibly removed must be allowed to return home when conditions allow. The right to self-determination must be respected and upheld. Ultimately, there must be a credible return to the political track. A two-state solution based on the pre-1967 borders and with East Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Palestine remains the only viable and just path towards sustainable peace. In this context, we welcome the forthcoming international conference to be convened by France and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and all relevant parties to engage constructively. We also commend the mediation efforts led by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, which have helped facilitate temporary humanitarian pauses. Mr. President, the Middle East stands at a critical crossroads. The suffering of civilians in Gaza, the instability in Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, and the stagnation of the peace process collectively underscore the need for renewed leadership and firm action. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Representative of Leone. I would now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I wish to thank the Assistant Secretary General, Mr. Khaled Kiari, for his briefing. And I closely followed what was said by the Observer State of Palestine and the Permanent Representative of Israel. The priority in the Near East is to obtain a ceasefire, one that is permanent and immediate in Gaza. The immediate and unconditional release of all hostages that have been illegally detained by Hamas, and the unfettered at-scale delivery of humanitarian aid. France continues to work tirelessly to achieve that goal. And we welcome the efforts made by its partners in that connection. France firmly condemns the expansion of the Israeli offensive to the centre of Gaza. Their evacuation orders have prompted the displacement of tens of thousands of people in Deir el-Balah and have hampered the work of manifold UN agencies. UN agencies that France once again would like to state that we support and trust them. That begins with UNRWA and the BCHH. The people, their personnel pay a disproportionate price for this tragedy. This new operation is worsening the humanitarian situation at an ever quicker pace. That situation is marked by malnutrition and the risk of famine. This situation is the result of the blockade imposed by Israel. France condemns in the very strongest terms Israeli fire on Palestinians in Gaza as they attempt to obtain humanitarian aid. This fire is thought to have killed over 1,000 people in recent months, or more according to the UN. Any attempts to bring about the forced displacement of Gaza's people, be these open or covert, are illegal and unacceptable. In the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, settlement activity must stop. It is a breach of international law. France staunchly opposes the resumption of the E1 settlement project. This project must not see the light of day. It is a violation of international law. It threats the prospect of the two-state solution. We must build an alternative to war in order to meet the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinians of having a state and to allow the Israelis and the Palestinians to live in peace and in security. The gravity of the situation in the Middle East must not distract the Council from what is happening in Lebanon, in Syria, and the Red Sea. In Lebanon, in spite of the manifold obstacles, we must continue our efforts to comprehensively implement Resolution 1701. That text has become all the more relevant following the ceasefire agreement of 26th of November 2024. The restoration of the Lebanese state's authority across its territory depends on implementing that resolution. They must retain the monopoly over the use of force across the full extent of Lebanese territory. To achieve that goal, renewing UNIFIL's mandate is vital if we are to support efforts taken in this connection on the part of Lebanese Authority and the LAF. In Syria, the ceasefire obtained last Saturday thanks to the US mediation efforts must be upheld. Humanitarian aid must be delivered in an unfettered fashion to Sueda, and civilians that wish to do so must be able to be evacuated in absolute safety. We call upon Israel to refrain from any and all unilateral actions likely to sow instability in Syria. The goal for this council must be to ensure that Syria is able to achieve an inclusive transition, to restore civic peace and recover its economy. The reconfiguration of the UN's presence in Syria must make it possible to support those goals. This is also the rationale behind France's efforts in support of these Syrian transitional authorities. In Yemen and the Red Sea, as in the rest of the region, the Houthis must put an end once and for all to their destabilizing actions in the Middle East. France calls for the resumption of the inter-Yemeni peace process under the aegis of the UN Special Envoy Hans Grunberg, who France fully supports. These efforts must allow us to fully implement the political, security and economic roadmap. Mr. President, a ceasefire agreement in Gaza could allow the Middle East to write a new chapter with the resumption of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. France is doing all it can to achieve that goal. With that in mind, we will co-chair alongside Saudi Arabia a high-level conference between on the 28th and 29th of July. This conference aims to ensure that the two-state solution can reach fruition through concrete steps. The conference also aims to spark anew a broad dynamic in favor of a political solution which meets the legitimate security concerns of Israel and which ultimately guarantees the contiguity and viability of the Palestinian state. The conference will strive to foster the recognition of Palestine, the normalization of its relations with Israel, and regional integration, as well as the reform of Palestinian governance and the disarmament of Hamas. We call upon all member states to participate at that conference at the highest possible level. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Representative of France. I would now give the floor to Representative of Panama.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We thank His Excellency Mohammed Sagdar, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Pakistan, for having convened this important meeting and for presiding over it. We also wish to thank Mr. Khalid Kiari, Assistant Secretary General for the Middle East, Asia and the Pacific, for his briefing. We welcome the ministers, senior officials and representatives from delegations. We thank them for their participation. The Middle East continues to be the epicenter of a growing conflict, the reach of which seems only to grow. Panama is monitoring with grave concern the dire situation which continues to prevail in the Syrian Arab Republic. There, countless outbreaks of violence have occurred, sectarian violence that is, have occurred in quick succession. These not only threaten the country's internal stability, but also the security of the region as a whole. We condemn the recent escalation of violence against civilians, including against religious and minority communities in Syria. We specifically refer here to the 22nd of June attack against the Greek Orthodox Church of Mar Elias in Damascus. We're also thinking of the sectarian violence in Sueda and the military operations in densely populated areas such as Daraa and the capital, Damascus. Against this backdrop, we reiterate that it is necessary to give a real chance to a political transition in Syria so that that transition can be genuinely inclusive and sovereign, in accordance with the parameters established by Security Council Resolution 2254. This transition should be buttressed by the constructive support of the international community, in particular that of the United Nations and its specialized agencies. Meanwhile, in Gaza, the humanitarian situation remains devastating. More than 80% of Gaza's population is displaced. They're living in bitterly difficult conditions with no adequate access to water, food, medical care, or basic services. The health system has collapsed, and thousands of children are suffering acute malnutrition. That is a humanitarian tragedy which demands urgent attention. Panama reiterates its urgent appeal for the restoration of an immediate ceasefire which can halt human suffering, facilitate the sustained, unfettered delivery of vital humanitarian aid at scale to Gaza, and one that can guarantee the immediate, dignified and unconditional release of all hostages that remain in Hamas's hands. We fervently condemn once again Hamas's actions. Since May, at least Some hundreds and hundreds of people have died while trying to access humanitarian aid in Gaza. That fact bears witness to the people's desperation and to the risks linked with assistance mechanisms alternative to those operated by the UN system. We insist that any effort must be governed by the fundamental principles of international humanitarian law. That is, humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. It comes as a surprise, and therefore it is a source of grave concern to note that due to an apparent lack of political will, or for other reasons which defy comprehension, it has not yet been possible to effectively deliver the aid in appropriate quantities as required desperately by the people of Gaza. This aid delivery must involve the participation of UN agencies. They have proven that they have the track record, experience, and capacity necessary to perform that task. Other stakeholders can join these UN efforts if they are able to complement the UN's work whilst adhering to humanitarian principles. With this in mind, Panama reaffirms its support for the UN agencies, including UNRWA and OCHA. And we once again reiterate our support for their personnel. Their humanitarian work has been vital, even in the most challenging environments. They have paid a high price with their sacrifice. All international efforts must be designed in such a way as to supplement and strengthen and not substitute or exclude existing humanitarian mechanisms. We're also concerned by the ever-worsening conditions in the West Bank. Their restrictions are worsening the suffering of the Palestinian people. The rising tide of regional instability has had repercussions in Lebanon. There, cross-border clashes and attacks continue along the Blue Line. This in spite of the ceasefire achieved in November 2024. Civilian victims have been produced and more than 93,000 people have been displaced. The Lebanese government and armed forces continue to face severe operational constraints in terms of exercising effective control in the south of the country, as the Council Resolution 1701 states that they must. Panama reiterates its staunch support for the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Lebanon, and its full support for the mandate of the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, UNIFIL. UNIFIL's work is vital if we are to avoid a regional escalation. We urge all parties to guarantee UNIFIL's freedom of movement, to step up tripartite coordination mechanisms, and to bolster their commitment to Resolution 1701 as the cornerstone from which we can move towards lasting peace and stability. The recent escalation between Israel and Iran made it patently clear that the region is highly interconnected. Tensions spiked and grave concern was sparked at an international level by the escalation. We also saw through that escalation the reach that a regional clash can have. It can unleash a snowball effect which not only has an impact on the countries directly involved, but also an impact on their allies and neighbours, and is liable to further complicate the geopolitical landscape. In this connection, we note with particular attention and optimism the recent cessation of hostilities agreement reached between the parties. That is a crucial step forward. We reiterate our appeal for diplomatic dialogue as the only legitimate and sustainable path along which to achieve peaceful and lasting solutions to the conflicts affecting the region. Regrettably, we have noted the resumption of illegal and unjustified attacks against merchant and commercial vessels in the Red Sea, waged by the Houthis. These attacks threaten maritime security and the freedom of navigation for vessels, and they imperil human lives as well as gravely affecting global supply chains. These attacks also hamper the delivery of essential humanitarian aid across the region. In Yemen, more than 5.2 million people are experiencing emergency levels of acute food insecurity. 11.9 million are in a situation of crisis. That is a reflection of the colossal humanitarian challenges facing the region. Mr. President, all of the above makes it patently clear that no event in the Middle East occurs in isolation. Consequently, we must take immediate and coordinated action to support the region as a whole. Ours must be a holistic approach, one which prioritizes both security and humanitarian assistance. The people of the Middle East have suffered the consequences of conflicts which are often fueled, always fueled indeed, by external geopolitical dynamics. These dynamics have perpetuated the cycle of violence. As Security Council members, we have a moral and political duty to actively contribute to changing this status quo. Our commitment must also hold steadfast when it comes to rebuilding the region. We must not only rebuild its infrastructure, but also its social fabric. If there is one truth that we must acknowledge about the Middle East, it is that this is a region comprising profoundly resilient people, each of which deserve a different now and a future full of hope. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Representative of Panama. Now I give the floor to the representative of United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I'd like to start by thanking Assistant Secretary General Chiari for his briefing. President, my Foreign Secretary has been unequivocal. The war in Gaza must end now. Hamas and Israel must both commit to a ceasefire now. A ceasefire is within reach, and we urge all sides to make it a reality, to secure the release of the hostages who have been cruelly held by Hamas since the 7th of October, and to end the appalling suffering of Palestinian civilians. I'll make 3 points. First, the Israeli aid system is inhumane, ineffective, dangerous, and fueling instability. Reports and images this week of children dying from starvation are beyond horrific. The IDF is shooting at desperate Palestinian civilians on an almost daily basis. Hamas is exploiting this disorder. We call on Israel to end these attacks, hold those responsible to account, and to work with the UN to implement effective aid distribution in line with humanitarian principles and international humanitarian law. And let me reaffirm the UK's firm and unequivocal support for the UN and OCHA in their brave efforts to get aid into Gaza. We also condemn recent strikes on the WHO in Deir el-Balah. Humanitarians and civilians must be protected. Second, we condemn Defence Minister Katz's proposals of forced displacement to Rafah. Illegal settlement expansion in the West Bank continues at pace, as well as settler violence and even terrorism against Palestinians. This is an accelerating campaign to prevent a Palestinian state. We condemn these attacks and call for Israel to hold its citizens to account. We also oppose the reintroduction of the E1 settlement plan, which is a flagrant breach of international law. Third, we are clear that Hamas must play no future role in the governance of Gaza or be able to threaten Israel's security again. However, the organization which represents a credible alternative to Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, is being undermined by Israeli actions. Israel is withholding $2.6 billion in clearance revenues, crippling the Palestinian economy and pushing essential health and education services to the brink. This is not conducive to Israel's security. President, The United Kingdom is resolute in our commitment to a two-state solution, and my Foreign Secretary has been clear that we are prepared to take further action to prevent the forcible erosion of the only viable path to lasting peace. Next week's conference, co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia, is a vital opportunity to demonstrate the strength of international resolve to secure a better future for Israelis, Palestinians, and the region. I thank you.
Thank you, Madam Representative of the United Kingdom. I would now give the floor to Representative of Guyana.
Your Excellency, Senator Mohammed Ishaq Dar, Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Pakistan. At the outset, my delegation thanks you for convening today's open debate on the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. I also thank Assistant Secretary General Khaled Kiari for the important updates provided, particularly regarding the persistent and inhumane crisis being experienced by civilians in Gaza. Mr. President, Guyana remains deeply concerned at the ongoing volatile security situation in the Middle East, fueled primarily by the violation of international law and the resort to forceful measures in response to perceived or real security threats. Should this trend continue, the insecurity and instability in the Middle East could destabilize the entire international system. Guyana continues to follow developments in the occupied Palestinian territories, where this trend is most pronounced. In Gaza, the result after 21 months of war is a humanitarian crisis of immense scale. Briefings by the United Nations over this period have highlighted massive and multiple instances of displacement of civilians, widespread food insecurity, with the risk of famine extremely high, and reports of even babies starving to death, and the inadequacy of the humanitarian response due to ongoing restrictions imposed by Israel. It is particularly striking, Mr. President, that an average of 28 children are killed daily in Gaza, as reported by UNICEF. Nothing can justify this crisis that has been deliberately created and foisted on Palestinian civilians. After witnessing the devastation in Gaza for almost 2 years, Guyana reiterates its call on Israel to comply with its obligations under international law, including those governing occupation and the conduct of war. Mr. President, Excellencies, evidence has shown that misinformation has been used as a weapon in this war. We have seen this in the allegations against UNRWA of being involved in terrorist activities, resulting in funding cuts to the agency last year, and ultimately to the Israeli government taking legislative action against it. This happened despite the lack of incontrovertible evidence to support the allegations. We are witnessing the same strategy at work regarding the operations of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the GHF. Despite the evidence that the GHF is not operating in accordance with humanitarian principles and the deliberate and daily killing and injury of civilians at GHF sites, we are told that the GHF is the best option to deliver aid to Palestinian civilians in need. The reports from the United Nations, however, tell a completely different story, which is also corroborated by reports from international NGOs and media sources privy to the situation in Gaza. It is important to counter all false narratives about what is happening in Gaza as a critical step towards addressing the impunity that has characterized actions there and for promoting accountability. We continue to rely on the UN and its partners in Gaza to this end. Mr. President, we continue to deplore the indiscriminate manner of Israel's strikes in Gaza, where it appears that virtually nothing is off limits. Targets have included people sheltering in schools and tents, people seeking food, water, nutrition supplies, or other assistance, medical and humanitarian relief personnel, and journalists. Following last week's strike on the Holy Family Church in Gaza, we took note of the explanation provided by the Israeli Defense Force, including its assertion that it directs its strikes solely at military targets. Guyana stresses that there should be no trivializing of the very serious consequences of Israel's war in Gaza, which has resulted in thousands of casualties. These consequences cannot be explained away. The road to accountability begins with fully acknowledging all violations of international law, including international humanitarian law. Mr. President, Excellencies, it is urgent that the parties reach agreement on a ceasefire in Gaza. The civilian cause continues to be alarming. It is also urgent that all hostages being held captive in Gaza be released without conditions. In the same vein, Palestinians detained in Israel without charge must also be released. The safety of humanitarian personnel must be guaranteed if they are to take full advantage of the limited lifting of restrictions on humanitarian access into Gaza. Moreover, we call on Israel to cooperate with the United Nations and its humanitarian partners to ensure that they can deliver life-saving assistance to civilians. Taking note of reports of plans to create a containment zone in Rafah, Guyana calls on Israel not to pursue any such plan that would further restrict the movement of civilians in Gaza and confine them to an even smaller space. We call for an end to the ongoing displacement of Palestinians in Gaza. We also call for an end to the ongoing violence against Palestinians in the West Bank, including violence perpetrated by settlers. Excellency, allow me to conclude by urging the Security Council to safeguard the rights of Palestinians. At the heart of this is enabling the exercise of their right to self-determination through the implementation of the two-state solution. Guyana remains fully supportive of this objective and hopes that the high-level conference on the two-state solution next week will advance this process. I thank you.
Thank you, Madam Representative of Guyana. I will now give the floor to the representative of United States.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister Dar, and thank you, Assistant Secretary General Khiari, for your briefing. Colleagues, the Middle East has a clear path to a better future. This Council must take concrete steps toward durable peace and prosperity. That starts with a future for the people in Gaza that is free of Hamas. This Council must meet the moment by pressuring Hamas to accept the ceasefire proposal already accepted by Israel, release the 50 remaining hostages held for more than 650 days, and disarm and leave Gaza forever. Shielding Hamas from accountability undermines Israel's security, rewards terrorism, and does nothing to improve the lives of Palestinians. We remind this Council and the world that there are still 2 American citizens, Itai Hen and Omer Nutra, held by Hamas. We also underscore that Hamas has held Hadar Goldin since 2014. It is past time for Hamas to return all those it has taken hostage. Hamas bears sole responsibility for the massacre it perpetrated on October 7th. It is likewise responsible for the resumption of hostilities in March, following Hamas's rejection of multiple ceasefire proposals. Mr. President, the representative of Israel has addressed allegations of genocide made by some in this room. I am also compelled to speak on this. These accusations are politically motivated and categorically false. They are part of a deliberate, cynical propaganda campaign as Hamas attempts to win symbolic victories to compensate for total defeat in war. The United States refutes these allegations entirely. America fully supports Israel's right to defend itself. Israel has taken numerous measures to limit harm to civilians and to address humanitarian needs. The loss of civilian life in Gaza is tragic, but the responsibility for this rests with Hamas, which could also stop the fighting today by agreeing to a ceasefire already accepted by Israel. I will also address allegations of Israel's plans to move Gazans to other countries. The United States does not support the forced displacement of Palestinians from Gaza. President Trump has said that nobody is expelling any Palestinians from Gaza. We also underscore, Mr. President, Hamas must accept the deal on the table. Anything short will only perpetuate the suffering of hostages in captivity, of their families desperate to unite with loved ones, and of Gazans who deserve to live free of Hamas's tyranny. Mr. President, with respect to the dire humanitarian situation, no one wants to see Palestinians in Gaza go hungry or thirsty. The United States supports getting assistance to civilians in Gaza. This should happen in a way that does not allow Hamas to benefit. We recognize the IDF's ongoing efforts to prevent civilian harm in Gaza. By contrast, Hamas's use of civilians as human shields is a deplorable violation of international humanitarian law. The United States stands for the protection of civilian lives during armed conflict in compliance with international humanitarian law. Mr. President, with respect to deaths of Palestinians while seeking aid, the United States mourns the loss of all innocent lives, and we agree that more assistance needs to safely reach those in need. I would point out that the most recent tragedy occurred near UN convoys after they passed through the Zakim crossing. It is unfortunate that the UN continues to turn down the offers of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation to collaborate and coordinate aid efforts. The United States also offers condolences for those killed at the Holy Family Church in Gaza. We have asked Israel to investigate the strike and ensure that all civilians, including Christians, remain safe. And with respect to the death of the American citizen in the West Bank, as Ambassador Huckabee has said, we have asked Israel to aggressively investigate the killing of Saif Musalat, an American citizen who was visiting family in Sinjil when he was beaten to death. There must be accountability for this criminal and terrorist act. Our condolences are with Saif's family. And we condemn criminal violence by any party in the West Bank and support actions to ensure all civilians, including Christian civilians, remain safe. The future for the Palestinians must start in Gaza without Hamas. Hamas must disarm and leave Gaza, and the hostages must return home. Quiet diplomacy, not performative actions in New York or elsewhere, will achieve that goal. Mr. President, turning to Iran, we are likewise at a critical juncture. On June 21st, the United States devastated Iran's nuclear facilities to end Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity and stop the threat posed by the world's foremost state sponsor of terror in support of Israel's right of collective self-defense. Now, with the U.S. negotiated ceasefire having brought an end to the 12-day war, Tehran faces a choice. On the one hand, Iran can continue its current path of defying the NPT-mandated safeguards obligations in a bid to reconstitute its nuclear program in secrecy. Already, Iran's law to suspend cooperation with the IAEA has obscured international visibility into its program. Iran can also continue to route vital state resources to a network of proxies and partners abroad to undermine regional security. Or, on the other hand, Iran can pursue a different course, ending its path to a nuclear weapon through meaningful, time-bound diplomacy. This track is the only means of realizing a durable peace, and with it, greater prosperity and global integration for Iran and its people. This path remains the preferred of the United States. We urge Iran to take it. In the absence of a deal, the United States continues to impose maximum diplomatic and economic pressure to constrain any activities, like the pursuit of a nuclear weapon, that would threaten the security of U.S. citizens, personnel, and partners in the region. We emphasize the July 1st statement of the G7 foreign ministers, which, first, reaffirmed that Iran can never have nuclear weapons and must refrain from reconstituting its unjustified enrichment activities. Second, called upon Iran to urgently resume full cooperation with the IAEA, including by providing verifiable information about all nuclear material in Iran and providing access to IAEA inspectors. And third, condemned the reprehensible calls in Iran for Director General Grossi's arrest and execution. Colleagues, the members of this Council and the world must stand united in ensuring Iran never obtains or develops a nuclear weapon. The United States will do its part to help forge a new reality for the Middle East alongside Israel and our Arab partners. It is our responsibility to realize the Middle East that earlier generations dreamt of, a region of peace, prosperity, safety, harmony, opportunity, innovation, and achievement. I thank you.
Thank you, Madam Representative of United States. I now give the floor to the representative of Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also join other colleagues thanking ASG colleague Kyari for his comprehensive briefing. Mr. President, for millennia, the Middle East has been a crossroad of civilization, with its abundant historical, cultural, and religious heritage. However, what we have been witnessing for almost 2 years now, unfortunately, represent a painful cycle of profound instability, the denial of coexistence, and a total destruction of a shared humanity. Hamas committed the worst terrorist attacks against Israel and still brutally holds 50 hostages. Israel's airstrikes and gunfire, as well as restrictions to humanitarian aid, are pushing Palestinian civilians in Gaza deeper into death and starvation. Not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, the Palestinian people's right to life, dignity, and coexistence is repeatedly being denied. In the wider Middle East region, sirens and airstrikes have become the new normal. Keeping in mind the pressing urgency in addressing these concerning realities, let me stress the following 3 points. First, we call on all parties in the region, notably Israel and Hamas, to recover common humanity. The horrific casualties, including 17,000 children killed in Gaza, the hunger, chaos, and killing in and around the GHF distribution sites, and the widespread destruction of civilian infrastructure, including religious, health, and UN sites, all elucidate staggering evidence of a loss of fundamental humanity. Meanwhile, we will not forget the terror and the shock that Hamas inflicted on Israel on October 7th, 2023. It is unconscionable that Hamas again still holds hostages and remains underneath tunnels regardless of the fear and despair of civilians in Gaza. As starvation surges, we call on Israel to end all restrictions on humanitarian assistance and allow the UN to deliver life-saving aid to those in need throughout Gaza. In this respect, we reaffirm our strong support for all humanitarian agencies of UN, including OCHA and UNRWA. Both parties must protect civilians and faithfully engage in talks to secure an immediate ceasefire and release of hostages. The war in Gaza must end now. Second, Israel and Palestinians, Jews, Muslims, and Christians must coexist in lasting peace and security. Any action that hinders this simple but clear proposition must immediately come to a halt. Violence by settlers in the West Bank, regardless of the nationality of the victims, is unacceptable, and thus all perpetrators must be held accountable in accordance with clear international standards. Israel must cease settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory, which are contrary to international law and Security Council resolutions. We oppose the announcement by Israel on the resumption of E1 settlements. This only will bifurcate a non-contiguous West Bank and further hamper future prospect for the two-state solutions. We also reject calls to forcibly relocate Palestinians in or outside of Gaza, such as the so-called humanitarian city plan, slated for the rubble where the city of Rafah once stood. We continue to extend our consistent support on efforts to revive the two-state solution. Third, all players must strive for de-escalation and stability throughout the region through diplomacy. We call on key players in the regions to adhere to the purpose and principles of the UN Charter, including the peaceful settlement of disputes and respect for territorial sovereignty. All actions that further aggravate insecurity, either on land or sea, must stop. Amid the endless spillover of violence in the region, we must seek ways to achieve peace through dialogue and diplomacy. In particular, ongoing talks in the region on non-proliferation now provide us with an important moment for diplomacy. We thus call on all parties in the region to seize any opportunity to secure regional peace and stability for the benefits of the people. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Representative of Republic of Korea. I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Rais.
Mr. President, at the outset, I express my country's appreciation for holding this open debate at a time when the challenges and accumulated crises facing the Middle East region are escalating without any bold and rooted solutions. I would also like to thank Mr. Khaled Khayari, Assistant Secretary General,
for the Middle East, for his valuable briefing on current developments. Mr. President, the occupied Palestinian territory, and in particular the Gaza Strip, continue to witness one of the most tragic human tragedies in modern times. With the number of victims exceeding 56,000, most of them women and children, with unprecedented destruction of civilian infrastructure, and millions deprived of water, food, or health care, the moral and legal imperative demands urgent and decisive action by this Council. The situation in Gaza has entered the stage of a de facto famine, with daily cases of children and adults collapsing as a result of severe malnutrition, a number of civilians dying as a result of military action,